The following story and photos are from Giant Panda King's book, Gotham 1919 to 1939, by Russell S. Beatty, available from www.giantpandaking.com. Viewer discretion is advised.
I suppose this is the end. All the roads have led here. And now it's almost over. Where do I even start?
In the aftermath of the Shadow War, Gotham's citizens were uproarious about the masked vigilantes and criminals in their city. Everyone had seen horrors and atrocities, the threat of extermination that Ra's al Ghul and his League of Assassins had represented. Gotham had seen too much death, destruction, and mayhem. Politicians gained public favor by saying they would take down the Batman and his rogues gallery. City officials called for an abolition of the relationship between the Gotham police and the Batman. The citizens of Gotham showed their disapproval in different ways. Some protested the Batman and his team, others wrote about their thoughts on the costumed heroes and villains. In spite of this outrage, there were some that reacted very differently. One such person was Laszlo Valentine. Valentine had grown up in Gotham. He was raised as a devout Roman Catholic. His parents were very strict in their following of church teaching, and Laszlo was no exception to his family's rigorous beliefs. As he grew older, his faith drove everything he did. He studied in college and became a surgeon right on the cusp of the Great War. When the war began, he enlisted and became a field surgeon. It was here, on the battlefield, that his faith was deeply shaken. The horrific sights and injuries that he faced every day made him question whether there was a God or not. Gradually, he began to realize that he no longer believed there was. This personal conclusion destroyed his sense of self. He reasoned that if there was no God, then there was no afterlife. And if there was no afterlife, then hell was out of the question. He now believed that no matter what actions he perpetrated, there would be no eternal consequences. This mentality, that his actions had no consequences, drove Valentine to adopt a new philosophy. Gone were his devout inhibitions. He now lived by the code, do what thou wilt. Valentine had never drank when he had been devout, so now he drank in excess, attempting to find liquor wherever he could. He had once fasted in observance of holy days, but now he ate gluttonously. Where he had abstained from fornication before, he now constantly found himself in brothels. He had reined in his hatred before, but now he let his rage loose. These questionable life choices caused many of his family and friends to discard him. He was no longer the person they had once known. He maintained his occupation as a surgeon, but he began to fall into ill repute. His colleagues regarded him as second-rate, and fewer patients began to come to Valentine for surgical procedures. Most people, given Valentine's new lifestyle, considered him nothing more than a gluttonous, greedy pig. At this point in his life, Valentine seemingly couldn't have cared less what others thought of him. He had spent most of his life growing up with strict rules and guidelines. He wasn't about to let the judgment of others outweigh his own. Not now that he had discarded his faith in the existence of God. This mentality of his came to a head eventually. When the Shadow War struck the streets of Gotham, Valentine was absolutely enthralled. Masked men and women of all sorts took to battling on the rooftops, the alleyways, and the streets. It was in the aftermath of the Shadow War that a sickening idea came to Valentine. Valentine took a cue from the masks he had seen during the Shadow War. Disappearances in Gotham were not uncommon. Kidnappings, murders, and other instances were unfortunate staples of the city. Following the aftermath of the Bat Team's battles against the League of Assassins, Gotham saw another string of kidnappings. These kidnappings, however, were abhorrent in nature. Children leaving school after their classes began to disappear. Concerned parents inquired to the police, but the police could find no leads. No one knew what to do until the letters began to arrive at the police station. These letters asked for a ransom of $5,000 for the return of Gotham's children. They were signed by a person referring to themselves as the Pig. The police, against the advice of the Batman, decided to give the ransom to this pig. The letters had instructed them to bring the money to a park and hand it to the driver of a black car. The kidnapper then claimed he would give them back one of the children. When the police handed the cash to the masked driver, he threw a large bag out of the window of the car and sped off. The Batman attempted to pursue in the Batmobile. The police, meanwhile, hesitantly approached the wriggling bag. Upon opening it, they found a small figure. It was a child, but something was wrong with them. The child was wrapped in bandages and had clear signs of surgical procedures, stitches and scars in various places. The police rushed the child to the hospital. Everything about this case was disturbing. The disappearance of the children, the unsettling letters, and now this horrendous mutilation of a child. The Batman pursued the black car that had received the ransom money. It led him to an abandoned butcher shop. The Bat chased the driver into the butcher shop. The sight that met him stopped him in his tracks. The interior of the shop had been gutted and turned into an operating theater of sorts. The room was lined with cages, all with children inside. The driver stood at the center of the room and turned to face the Batman. The kidnapper wore a grotesque mask resembling the face of a pig. He brandished a knife, calling himself Professor Pig. He stated that he was merely trying to make the children perfect. It was then that the Batman looked more closely at the children in the cages. Some of them were fine, untouched by this lunatic. It was the others, the ones whose mouths were surgically affixed in smiles, that left him in shocked, angry silence. Pig explained that he had seen so many unhappy, displaced children during the Great War. He told the Bat that they would no longer have to be unhappy now. The Bat rushed at Pig. He pummeled the kidnapper with an onslaught of blows, knocking the criminal to the ground. When the Batman drew back, panting and hands covered in blood, Pig lay on the floor, beaten and unconscious. The police soon arrived, but the Bat had already left after informing them of his location. He didn't want to risk the bad graces of the authorities. Public perception of masks was still negative after the Shadow War. Pig was unmasked and revealed to be Laszlo Valentine. Valentine's sanity was in question. He rambled on about his need to make the children perfect. His victims were immediately rushed to the hospital and treated. Their families were informed. Further inspections revealed that the children who had been surgically altered also had their tear ducts removed. It seemed that Pig's idea of perfection involved making the children appear permanently happy, unable to frown and unable to cry. Psychologists and doctors worked with Pig, but none could figure him out. Pig kept referring to the children as his dolls. To Gotham, Pig was further evidence that masked villains and heroes were a sickness in the city. To the Batman, it seemed to be a sign that his time was coming to an end. He had been unable to save all the children Pig had kidnapped. His failure was evident to himself. If Gotham were to continue being protected, the Batman needed to find his replacement. Gotham would always need a Batman.
As I record this, I think back to the beginning. I was young, naive, and idealistic. I probably thought I was doing good, even though countless still suffered.
Harley Quinn was a woman whose life was filled with turmoil, abuse, and manipulation. She had been with the Joker for years, enduring endless abuse and control. The Joker was a man completely self-absorbed, no matter what facade he put on for her at times. At the end of the day, Joker always twisted everything to make Harley feel figuratively smaller than him. Harley endured all of his abuse because she had convinced herself that she loved him. She was willingly blind to the fact that Joker did not actually care for her. Harley herself had abandoned her former life, murdering her father, her job at Arkham, her aspirations and dreams. Killing her father was something that still haunted Harley. He had been cruel, but he had been family. Harley had lost her way and sense of self, but with the help of Pamela Isley, she found the strength to break away from this abusive relationship. The two of them met during their own respective crime sprees. They had both set their eyes on the millionaire Bruce Wayne and had planned to kidnap him separately. Harley and Ivy clashed and accidentally spoiled each other's plans. While they were initially angry with each other, they fled the scene together when the police began to arrive. The two parted ways, but it would not be the last they saw of each other. They eventually realized they had a lot in common. They traded a lot of correspondence, and Harley kept this from the Joker. Pamela and Harley sparked a deep friendship, one that some still speculate was romantic in nature. It was a difficult decision to leave the Joker, but it was one that ultimately saved Harley's life. For the first time, Harley felt free. In the years that followed, Harley found herself in and out of jail. She found being a solo act difficult at first, but every time she fell, she got back up again. She made deals for reduced sentences, turning state witness against the Joker. This was, in her mind, the best way to get back at him. She decided that she would use justice, kindness, and her own brand of violence to get what she wanted. Harley gave numerous public testimonies to the atrocities the Joker had committed and coerced her into. Her bravery and resilience captured the attention of the press and media, and she quickly became a sort of celebrity through media and newspapers. The name of Harley Quinn became one of resilience, bravery, and independence across America for some, and a name of contention with others. She became an icon for suffragists and women everywhere, but a controversial figure as well for those opposing said groups. Despite her newfound fame, Harley couldn't resist the temptation of a life of crime. It felt good to be looked up to and to be in good public standing, but she longed for the freedom to stand up to further injustices in her own way. She saw the way women were treated in Gotham, let alone America, and wanted to fight the corrupt system in the way she knew. Using her underworld contacts, she formed her own gang, the Red Triangle Gang, and became the leader of her own team. As Harley's fame continued to grow, she became an inspiration to many. Women everywhere in America told stories about her courage in standing up to the cruelty she had faced. Film actors like Helen Kane, Clara Bow, and even the iconic cartoon character Betty Boop all copied her mannerisms and speech, cementing her status as a pop culture icon. Harley's Brooklyn-style accent was one of the most popular things to be emulated in entertainment. Even years later, Harley would be reimagined in a variety of media. In spite of all this, Harley had never forgotten her roots. She knew deep down that she had done things she was not proud of, but she would work, in her own way, to undo the wrongs she had done. She had robbed, stolen, and killed, and wanted to make reparations, less for society and more for herself. She had forgiven herself for murdering her father. She wanted to be true to herself. She continued to live her life on the edge, always one step ahead of the law. The Gotham City police were hard-pressed to pin anything on Harley. She was good about keeping her endeavors in the shadows. When she was directly involved in her gang's activities, she made sure that it was out of the public eye. She couldn't have any witnesses providing testimony to the authorities. The members of the Red Triangle Gang, while still committing illegal activities, were all loyal to Harley. Most of them came from circus backgrounds or sideshows and understood being tread on by society. Harley always made sure that the jobs they pulled brought in enough to keep them on their feet. She cared about the people that worked for her. Harley's story is one of triumph over adversity. The cruelty she had faced had been a dark cloud hovering above her for so much of her adult life. Despite the abuse and control she endured, she found the strength to break away and forge her own path through her friendship with Pamela Isley. She had still turned back to a life of crime and was constantly at odds with the Batman and his team, but she stood firmly on her own 2 feet now. In Harley's mind, she was now more free than she ever had been. It is still heavily debated whether her impact on Gotham was positive or negative, but it had definitely affected the lives of many. Positively, she had shown that breaking away from the abuse she had suffered allowed her freedom. Countless women in Gotham saw themselves in her and were inspired to stand up for themselves. Even in later years, she would have the chance again to help in a fight against a great evil. Until then, she had stepped out of the overbearing shadow of the Joker, formed a group loyal to her, and made a name for herself. Harley had come from humble origins, but now the world knew who she was. Her bravery and resilience inspired people around the world, and her legacy continues to live on today through both pop culture and history.
Have I done everything in my power to protect this city? I don't know anymore. Sometimes it seems as if every criminal we put behind bars are replaced the next day by 10 more.
Maximilian Zeus, or Maxie, was a charismatic conman who lived in Gotham City in the mid to late 1920s. He reinvented himself as a spiritual health leader. No one knows much about his background, just that he had been abroad in Europe and only recently returned. Zeus's charisma and speaking abilities lent him a gravity that seemed to draw people in. His popularity grew among the progressive-minded, and he founded the New Olympia movement to promote the values of ancient Greece. Zeus taught his followers that the ancient pantheon of Greek gods held aspects of humanity that had to be nurtured in order to find inner fulfillment. He wrote books that preached the benefits of living an ancient lifestyle, but with a modern twist. Members of New Olympia ate only foods that would have been available in ancient Greece, wore simplistic clothing similar to togas, and lived in a compound owned by Zeus. The modernity came into play, wherein Zeus would make numerous press statements, and the group still had access to radio and other media outlets. They had access to modern medical care, but also used holistic medicinal alternatives. The group had the opportunity to live the ancient Greek lifestyle while still maintaining the modern conveniences of their era. It was, in their minds, the best of both worlds. Zeus had taken control of their behavior through this lifestyle. His group would gain a lot of publicity in Gotham. His followers supported him financially as well. He asked them for funds and promised deeper enlightenment in return. He began to exert more control over his followers, doubling down on his delusions of grandeur and theatrics. His followers were only allowed to digest media he had approved: books, broadcasts, and contact with the outside world. He had seized control of their information. Zeus next began to preach against outsiders, claiming that they were lost souls and only those within New Olympia were saved. He had taken control of his followers' thoughts. Lastly, he spurred on their emotions, proclaiming outsiders as persecutors of their group. Zeus had become more than just a spiritual leader. He had formed a cult. Absolute power corrupts, and as Zeus found his following growing, his mind began to give way. The wealth and power began to make him think that he was above the law, immune to the trappings of average people. Zeus eventually started to believe he was a living god, that he was a living incarnation of the ancient Greek god whose name he bore. Some of his followers believed it too. Their time each day was spent revolving around the care of their living god. Zeus was waited on hand and foot, and his followers seemed happy from the outside. But on the inside was a dark secret. It was later revealed that Zeus was using his celebrity status to lure women into his circle and abuse them. Zeus's ego would not let him admit that he had become an abomination of a person. His followers within New Olympia turned a blind eye to his actions and worked to cover them up. Some of them even perversely saw this as further evidence that Zeus was a god. Many women never spoke out, and those who did weren't believed. But when Julie Madison became a victim, Bruce Wayne began looking into the New Olympia movement. Julie Madison was a part of the same social circles as Bruce Wayne. She had been born into money but was bored by it. She used her time and resources on the board of directors at Arkham Asylum, helping raise funds to better the facilities and the help they were giving the inmates. Eventually, she crossed paths with Bruce Wayne. He wasn't really her type. His seeming flippancy and playboy publicity reminded her of others in their social circles. The more they interacted, however, the more she sensed that there was more beneath the mask he put on in public. The two began a short-lived relationship fraught with lies and secrecy. Bruce was never forthcoming with his nightly activities, and Julie, understandably, resented and distrusted him for it. After the two parted ways, Julie was distressed. She had put more into the relationship than Bruce had, and she felt betrayed. Looking for something new, she turned to the New Olympia movement, taking Gotham by storm. A friend of hers had introduced her to it, and she gradually became more and more involved. When she saw the injustices and atrocities occurring in the group, she attempted to leave, but her colleagues stopped her. They were keeping her there against her will. Bruce heard of this from Julie's concerned family members and rescued her as the Batman. This was the catalyst for the start of his investigation into the cult. The stories he uncovered from former members of the movement were startling. Zeus was now exerting so much control over his followers that they would fight, die, and kill for him. The Batman would eventually expose Maxi Zeus as a predator who had assaulted close to 80 women. He brought his findings to both the police and the press, completely destroying Zeus's public image. The police raided Zeus's compound and made numerous arrests, Maxi Zeus among them. The only ones found guilty were Zeus and his inner circle. The rest had to undergo psychological treatment. The Batman considered this case as one of the biggest failures of his crime-fighting career, and he would always regret not stopping Zeus sooner. Countless members of his movement had been psychologically affected, and countless women had been violated by a madman. Despite this heart-wrenching failure, the Batman continued to fight crime in Gotham City, always seeking to bring justice to those who had been wronged. In the end, Maxi Zeus was brought to justice, and his victims finally had their voices heard. The testimonials of his victims were damning and lent to his conviction and sentencing. Zeus swore vengeance on the Batman, whom he referred to as his lesser brother, Hades. This declaration never came to fruition as Zeus spent the rest of his days in prison. Zeus had fashioned himself after the god of lightning, so it seemed darkly fitting that he was sentenced to the electric chair. Gotham would never see his return. Batman continued to protect the city from villains like Maxi Zeus, but he never forgot the lessons he learned from this case. He always looked closer at every case, not wanting to miss any detail that might allow him to save more people. He remained vigilant against those who would abuse their power. Politicians, crime bosses, and masked villains were his primary focus. The Batman never lost sight of the fact that justice must always be served, no matter the cost. In spite of this spark of renewal in his crusade, the Batman was tired and burnt out. Bruce knew that he would not be able to continue on this way. He continued to seek alternatives for protecting Gotham, and he began to lean more heavily on his compatriots to do so. Gotham was protected. For now.
It seems as though each new costume criminal is worse than the last. The terrors that they dream up more horrific with each scheme.
When injustice occurs, there are two responses people can give. The first one is to turn a blind eye, to protect oneself from the repercussions. The other response is to stand up to the injustice, take it on, and face it headlong. To speak up in the face of injustice is a difficult but moral action. One such person who did this in Gotham was Stephanie Brown. Stephanie had grown up in Gotham all her life. Her father had been affected by the Great Depression. Her father, Arthur Brown, had been one of the unfortunate many to lose their jobs during the recession. Stephanie's mother had died not long after giving birth to her daughter. Stephanie herself was an intelligent child with an eye for detail. When radio reports of the Batgirl began to circulate, Stephanie was very taken with the idea that a woman could fight for justice in a city like Gotham. Because of his unemployment, and in order to take care of himself and Stephanie, Arthur took to small-time criminal activities. Picking pockets and mugging lone pedestrians allowed him to keep them on their feet for a little while. Stephanie was mostly unaware of her father's criminal activities, but she did have suspicions. Her keen eye and awareness made certain things hard to miss. Arthur's late nights, his demeanor, and his secrecy around her struck her as odd. Stephanie spent many nights home alone. Over the course of time, however, Arthur's small-time career came to a head. Arthur, after attempting to mug someone, came face-to-face with Robin, the Batman's apprentice. The boy wonder easily defeated and apprehended Arthur, and it seemed like Arthur would go to jail. Thinking quickly, Arthur pleaded his case to Robin. He told Robin about his daughter and how he was just trying to feed her and himself, that he would give up petty criminal activity. It seemingly worked. Robin let Arthur go, and Arthur returned home. When Stephanie saw her father after his encounter with Robin, she could tell that something had changed. Arthur seemed more grim than usual. She could tell that something had happened, but she dared not ask. Internally, Arthur was angry. His main source of income was no longer a viable option. His defeat at Robin's hands had shown him that he wasn't cut out for small-time crimes. He realized that if a child could defeat him, he needed to be smarter. He needed to think multiple steps ahead. After much thought, a new idea came to him. He began pouring himself into researching Gotham politicians, police officials, and other figureheads in the city. He learned everything he could about their lives, their friends, their rivals, and their business endeavors. After enough digging, Arthur eventually uncovered a massive scandal. Gotham oil magnates had been bribing local politicians to gain access to federal land. This land, set aside as an emergency oil reserve, was being illegally harvested by these companies in order to turn a profit. Arthur spent tireless days acquiring the necessary evidence, photographs, stolen documents, and correspondence. Arthur immediately used this evidence to set to work extorting the individuals involved. These corrupt individuals began to receive letters from a mysterious figure calling himself the Clue Master. During all of this, Stephanie Brown grew very suspicious of her father. Arthur spent long days away from home, and when he returned, shut himself up in his room. One day, while her father was gone, Stephanie ventured into his room. What she saw inside shocked her. Laid out in front of her were the details of her father's plans. Stephanie saw the moniker Clue Master among them. She felt immense shock at the fact that she had just discovered she did not truly know her father. Hearing a sound at the door, she turned to see her father standing in the doorway, his face twisted by rage. He ran at her, and Stephanie stumbled. She crashed through the window of the room. Scrambling to her feet, Stephanie fled. Not knowing who to turn to, Stephanie turned to the police. When she shared the plans her father had made, however, they did not believe her. According to them, a scandal involving a criminal mastermind and multiple politicians and city officials seemed too fantastical of a story. Stephanie was frustrated and exhausted, but before she could leave, a detective stopped her. Her name was Renee Montoya. Montoya told her that she believed her story and would look into it. Stephanie thanked her out loud, but internally she decided that it wasn't enough. If the police wouldn't do anything about it, she determined that she would. Stephanie had been inspired by the masked vigilantes in Gotham. If her father was going to make plans and be this clue master, then she would work to spoil his plans. Stephanie's thoughts inevitably turned to her hero, the Batgirl. Donning a mask and costume of her own, Stephanie Brown became the spoiler. Using what she had gleaned from her father's notes, she hit various locations that he had listed as information caches. During one of these raids, someone spotted her. As she was leaving the building, the Batman and Robin confronted her. The Batman told her off for causing trouble and for breaking into various places in the city. The spoiler tried to explain what she was doing, but the Batman gave her one final warning and left. Robin followed after the Bat, but gave the spoiler an understanding glance first. Much of the following events are lost to time, but what is known is that the spoiler eventually teamed up with Robin to build a case against Arthur Brown and bring him to justice. Robin must have felt sympathetic and gone against the Batman's wishes to work with the spoiler. Together, they confronted the Clue Master after he took a hostage at an oil refinery. They fought him, saved the hostage, and thwarted his plans, saving the city from his blackmail scheme. The corruption of the Gotham City officials was also brought to light, and they were prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The Clue Master vowed that he would get revenge on Robin and the spoiler, but he would remain in prison. Although Stephanie was saddened to see her father behind bars, she knew that it was the right thing to do, and was proud of her role in bringing him to justice. Through her actions as the spoiler, Stephanie proved that even the daughter of a criminal could become a hero and stand up for what was right. Even though the Batman had initially dismissed her, over time she gained his trust. The spoiler was welcomed onto the Bat team, and she brought her investigative skill set. Stephanie also got to meet Barbara Gordon and learned that she had been the Batgirl. It was a dream come true. One day she was just a citizen of Gotham, and the next she was fighting alongside like-minded people for justice. Stephanie also got along quite well with Robin. There is some speculation by historians of romantic involvement, but there are very little records to go on. What is known is that they continued to work together on numerous cases and even helped thwart an escape attempt from Blackgate Penitentiary by Edward Nygma, the Riddler. Stephanie's bravery and tenacity inspired others to follow in her footsteps and fight against corruption and injustice in their own communities. In her mind, the spoiler's journey was just beginning. Little did she know that the Batman's journey was coming to an end.
I've had allies along this journey. Some have been good friends. Some have become enemies.
It was a cold winter evening in 1937, and Julian Day sat by the fireplace in his small apartment, staring blankly into the flames. It was close to the holiday season, but his thoughts were far from the joy that it would normally bring most people. Memories of his childhood flooded back, and he shuddered as he remembered the years of abuse he had suffered at the hands of his parents. They had been cruel to him, rarely praising his achievements and frequently pointing out his flaws. They would also beat him if he misbehaved or drew negative attention to either one of them. But it wasn't just these things that his thoughts dwelled on. What haunted him the most was the memory of that fateful Christmas day, years ago, when he had snapped and taken his parents' lives. Julian recalled feeling helpless, alone, and unheard. His parents exerted control over almost every facet of his life. All he had wanted was one present for Christmas that year. He didn't care what it was. He just wanted that one luxury. His parents had dismissively promised him that Santa would bring him one. This was months before the holiday, and Julian was elated. He had previously felt like he had reached his tipping point with their cruelty, but this promise kept him going. Julian did his best to stay well-behaved and be a model child for the rest of the year. When Christmas Day arrived, Julian went to the main room of their home. There was no present under the tree. He asked his parents why Santa hadn't brought him anything, and they responded by telling him that Santa Claus wasn't real. The rage began to boil within Julian as his mother and father shrugged it off. He stormed out of the room and straight to his father's dresser. He drew his father's pistol from it. If his parents wouldn't let him have control of his own life, he decided he would take it himself. Filled with rage and resolve, he returned downstairs and shot his parents dead. He then continued to celebrate the holiday with their corpses. The police eventually arrived. Reports of gunshots had reached them. All of these events were recounted in interviews after Julian Day's arrest. Decades later, some would theorize that Julian could have had a lesion on the frontal lobe of his brain. This could have resulted in sudden, violent outbursts. Julian had been in and out of institutions for years since that day, but he knew that he could never be truly free. His grim reputation had followed him wherever he went. This hung over him like a dark shadow. He eventually managed to stay out of institutions long enough to start taking odd jobs, but he was never employed long. He would either be fired or quit himself. Every time a holiday came around, he would be unable to stop thinking about that fateful Christmas years ago. He began to slip, and again he snapped. At the sight of a family walking down the street near Easter Day, he began to follow them. For the next 2 days, he watched them, learning their routine, and eventually broke into their home on Easter morning. He murdered them in their own home, unable to control himself due to his impulses. The name Calendar Man was coined by the media. It burned into Julian's mind. He began to repeat this macabre tradition of killing families and spending holidays with their corpses. The authorities were hard-pressed to stop this Calendar Man. Seemingly no one was safe around the holidays. It was a dark and twisted world that Julian had created for himself. He was horrified with himself at first, but he couldn't help feeling a twisted sense of satisfaction as the years went by. He had felt so out of control, and taking these lives gave him a twisted, morbid sense of taking matters into his own hands. As the years raged on, Julian found himself struggling to survive, but he refused to give up his twisted way of life. He even went as far as to carve the different months of the year into his forehead and stretched around the rest of his head. It was a gruesome sight to behold, but Julian was proud of it. He continued to plan his killings meticulously, scouting houses and families for days, even weeks. He would choose his victims carefully and learn everything he could about them. Julian also crafted his costumes, dressing up for each holiday. He found that no one batted an eye when the Easter Bunny was sighted on Easter, or Santa Claus was seen walking around downtown Gotham near Christmas time. The police had been on his trail for years, but somehow he always managed to evade them and continue his gruesome tradition. Eventually, he was bound to slip up. His work became sloppy, and he accidentally left various clues leading to his identity. When the Batman picked up the case, these clues became damning for Julian. As Julian sat in his apartment, listening to the radio and waiting for his next opportunity, he couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep this up. After all these years, he had grown tired. He knew he would be caught by the Batman, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. Even as the Batman came crashing through his window, Julian Day's thoughts most likely went to his first kill, that of his family. Regardless of the brutality he had wrought on others, he now just felt numb. All that was left of him was the Calendar Man. The Calendar Man had become a part of him, and he knew that he would never be able to escape his twisted desires.
Friends turned enemies, enemies turned friend. It gets hard to keep the record straight.
Luke Fox, the son of Lucius Fox, grew up in Europe in the wake of the race massacres in Rosewood, Florida, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. The horrors wrought upon people of color in those towns caused high tension across the country, tension between black people and their allies, and those whose intentions toward them were diabolical. Lucius was not impervious to this animosity. As the crusade of the Batman began, Lucius also feared for the repercussions of dealing with Gotham's criminal element. He was concerned about his son's safety and wanted to distance Luke from Bruce Wayne's clandestine activities. If anyone were ever to catch wind of Lucius's involvement with the Bat, the consequences for his family would be dire. Lucius believed it was best for Luke to receive education in a different country for safety. Regardless, Luke had no interest in leading a safe life as his father envisioned. He saw his father's attempt at avoiding racial violence as justified, but he couldn't understand why he had to be so distanced from his father's work. Lucius wouldn't tell him about the true nature of his involvement with Bruce Wayne. In Luke's mind, he wondered if his father didn't want him around. So, instead of following his father's wishes, he joined the 3rd Marching Regiment of the Foreign Legion, a division of the French military. He later transferred to the Metropolitan French Army unit after completing his service. Luke gained a reputation among his peers as a driven, dedicated soldier and friend. People took notice of him, and he was valued greatly. Eventually, he found himself serving as an air gunner in the French Air Service, successfully completing over 30 combat missions. Luke returned to Gotham after receiving news of his father's death, and he initially blamed the Batman and the other masked vigilantes that plagued the city. He saw his father as an innocent casualty caught in the middle of a war that wasn't his. He was angry at the Bat for putting his father so readily in harm's way. The explosion that had claimed Lucius's life had been officially ruled a terrorist attack, but Luke suspected the so-called Shadow War had been responsible. In turn, if this were true, the Batman had been involved somehow. He eventually discovered the truth, that his father had been responsible for making the Bat's crusade possible. In doing so, Lucius had aided in saving the lives of hundreds. After begrudgingly listening to the Batman's explanation, Luke's opinion of the vigilante began to change. The Batman revealed his identity to the young man as a show of trust and faith. Luke decided to honor his father's memory by assisting Bruce Wayne, alias the Batman, in the best way he knew how. He wanted to fill the shoes left behind by Lucius and help to save as many people as he could from a fate like his father's. Adopting the codename Batwing, Luke became both a pilot and valuable asset to the Bat team. His codename referred both to himself and to his aircraft, a plane provided by the Batman. He provided crucial air support during their operations and was dispatched on missions across Europe when needed, especially as tensions escalated leading up to the Second World War. Luke's transformation into Batwing not only showcased his determination to make a difference, but also highlighted his unique skill set as a seasoned airman. Over the years, he proved himself indispensable by pulling off missions that seemed impossible at times. With his expertise in combat and navigation, he became a crucial ally to the Batman and his allies. As the world slipped closer and closer to the chaos of the Second World War, Batwing's contributions became increasingly paramount, solidifying his status as a vital member of the team. Luke's journey from a young man seeking purpose in Europe to a hero fighting alongside the Batman exemplified his unwavering dedication to preserving justice and honoring his father's legacy. Batwing was exactly the kind of ally that the Batman knew he could rely upon. In the coming conflict, allies were exactly what the Bat would need if he was to survive. Luke Fox paved his own way forward and would impact Gotham greatly in the years to come. He would even have a chance to impact the world.
And so many are dead. Too many. Because of me.
In the bustling city of Gotham, Jack Ryder, a charismatic radio host, had an insatiable curiosity. He was known to rub elbows with the high society of Gotham in spite of his own humble upbringing. He had hosted exposés on the mob, the politicians and Cluemaster's blackmail scheme, and even on the Court of Owls. His curiosity drove him to uncover the truth behind the enigmatic costumed figures that captured the press. Over time, however, his shows and his writing felt more and more stale. Jack was very hard-pressed to compete with other big names in radio such as Edward Bowes and Eddie Cantor. Jack's coverage of the happenings in Gotham lacked one thing: first-hand experience. He harkened back to his coverage of Mr. Freeze's attack on the city. That had been one of his most popular shows. Jack had a tendency towards addictive personality. He drank excessively during this depressive time in his career. Eventually, he got out of that place and decided to set out and restore his fading glory. Determined to get the inside scoop, Jack devised a daring plan. He would become a costumed hero himself. Donning an outfit inspired by the eerie characters of German expressionist films, he took to the streets at night, observing events from the shadows. With a pale face, wild green hair, and a red and yellow outfit, he earned himself the moniker, the Creeper. As word began to spread about the Creeper's nightly activities, Jack Ryder was the first to capitalize on his own idea. No one could know it was actually him. The Creeper's ambiguous nature puzzled the citizens of Gotham. Was he a force for good or a harbinger of chaos? The Creeper had a tendency to stay aloof from conflicts, but sometimes his mere presence was off-putting to criminals. The more superstitious ones would leave the scene of the crime altogether upon sighting him. Jack reveled in the mystery, relishing the attention and speculation surrounding his true intentions. The uncertainty towards him that was held by the public gave him an edge. In his radio shows, he really leaned into the theories and speculations circulating about him. His popularity began to skyrocket. Given time, he suddenly found himself conflicted. Jack knew that he wanted to be a hero and help the city, but his bizarre appearance and costume seemingly threw doubt on that among speculators. Initially, he saw his alter ego as a means to bolster his radio program's popularity, but soon his activities as the Creeper consumed him entirely. As he delved deeper into his role as the Creeper, he found himself increasingly drawn to the thrill and adrenaline that came with it. In his pursuit of justice, Jack's addictive personality led him down a dangerous path. Before, it had mainly focused on the consumption of alcohol, but now it was more serious. He managed to obtain a diluted form of venom, a notorious new steroid enhancer that had begun circulating the streets of Gotham. It heightened his senses and enhanced his physical capabilities, but at a cost. The drug took hold of him, and Jack became dependent on its power. As venom coursed through his veins, Jack's body underwent a transformation. His strength and agility surged, but so did his erratic behavior and aggression. The line between hero and villain blurred, leaving those around him uncertain of which persona they would encounter. The media began to dub him a Jekyll and Hyde of the streets, a being of unpredictable chaos. The Creeper's actions became a source of fear and caution, with whispers spreading throughout the city to beware his presence. Jack Ryder had become entangled in his own addictive pursuit. He was torn between his original intentions and the alluring darkness that consumed him. The streets of Gotham grew fraught with tension as the Creeper's actions became increasingly unpredictable. The police and the Bat team responded to numerous reports of criminals and citizens alike being accosted by the Creeper, but were often too late to respond. Predicting the Creeper's movements and appearances proved difficult at best. The citizens learned to be wary, never knowing if they would encounter the hero or the villain. Some even became obsessed with him. One artist in particular was driven to insanity by obsession with the Creeper, worried that the Creeper was coming for them. Almost without realizing it, Jack Ryder had become a pawn in his own addictive game. He had set out to do good and restore his career, but had ultimately fallen into a hole too deep for him to climb out of on his own. The city would continue to hold its breath, unsure of what the Creeper would do next. The Creeper would remain active, waiting and hoping to be set free from his prison, one of his own making. Criminals would be terrified of encountering him. The whispers would resound in the streets. Beware, beware the Creeper.
Where was I? Oh, yes. The beginning. It started with a promise.
An old man sat in his home, sipping a cup of tea in front of the fireplace. His hands were shaking slightly. The previous weeks had been strenuous. This was not due to work or physical exertion. It was because this man had seen old friends of his murdered in cold blood in the papers. Because this old man knew that he was next. As he sat drinking his tea, a voice sounded behind his armchair.
Sal Valestra, your angel of death awaits.
Years before donning his cape and cowl, Bruce Wayne, the enigmatic billionaire, found himself utterly captivated by the elegant and intelligent Andrea Beaumont. Andrea was from a relatively well-to-do family in Gotham. Her father, Charles Beaumont, was an accountant for the rumored crime boss Rupert Thorne. His ties to Thorne's operation had given them more financial success than most. Andrea and Bruce's relationship unfolded against the backdrop of their college years, with Harvey Dent also vying for Andrea's affections unsuccessfully. Harvey was also in college with them both. He eventually gave up. It was the profound connection between Bruce and Andrea that set them apart from the rest. So profound was their bond that Bruce even contemplated forsaking his crime-fighting aspirations to build a life with her. It was not a contemplation that he took lightly, but with her, he envisioned a future filled with happiness and love. Bruce was even preparing to propose. But fate, relentless in its cruelty, intervened. Andrea vanished suddenly from Bruce's life without a trace. It left him devastated and desperate for answers. In his relentless search for these answers, he discovered an unsettling letter penned by Andrea herself. It was in her former home, left in the main hall. The words written there shattered his heart, vaguely stating that she was not the person he had believed her to be and urging him to move on. Confusion struck Bruce at this revelation. It felt like a betrayal. Bruce was left to grapple with the pain of loss, closing himself off from love for years to come. Many people would come into his life, but he held himself back, building a wall up around his heart. It served to intensify the grim resolve that would one day transform him into the Batman. Destiny, with its mysterious ways, had a different plan in store for Andrea and Bruce. Years later, Andrea suddenly resurfaced in Gotham. Bruce, learning of her reappearance, was drawn into her orbit once more. He heard from a mutual friend of theirs, Arthur Reeves, that she had returned. Arthur had been in the employ of Andrea's father years earlier and was now a city councilor. At this point, Bruce had taken up the mantle of the Batman. The two were reunited, but Andrea kept Bruce at arm's length. He could tell that she was holding something back. It took time, but the two eventually had time to themselves. Andrea revealed that her father had been the reason that they had left so suddenly all those years ago. Whatever business Charles Beaumont had with Rupert Thorne had ended badly. Thorne had sent some enforcers to threaten Charles, and Charles had told his daughter they were leaving the country. Andrea told Bruce she hadn't wanted to, but had been given no choice. Coinciding with this revelation, a string of grisly murders began in Gotham. Older former mobsters were being picked off one by one, their throats slashed. It didn't take long for the Batman to determine their connection. Charles Chucky Soule, William Buzz Bronski, and Salvatore Valestra had all been murdered and had all worked for Rupert Thorne as enforcers. The killer was rumored to be like a ghost, leaving hardly any trace behind. Gotham's newspaper publishers and radio hosts began to refer to the killer as a phantasm. The Batman suspected Charles Beaumont to be this killer. He theorized that Charles was trying to gain revenge on his tormentors. As his investigation unfolded, he realized with horror that Charles Beaumont had been murdered not long after leaving the country. Curiosity turned to suspicion as he realized it could only be one person: Andrea. Andrea had indeed invented the mantle of the Phantasm. She had embarked on a relentless mission to exact her revenge. Bruce, torn between empathy for her pain and his steadfast commitment to justice, could not condone the lethal brand of justice she dispensed. She had murdered Soule, Bronski, and Valestra, and she now had her sights set on Rupert Thorne. Thorne had recently been released from prison due to severely declining health. He was on house arrest, holed up in his estate. The Batman staked out the home, waiting for the Phantasm to arrive. Inevitably, she did. The Bat confronted her within Thorne's estate, and in the scuffle, the house was set ablaze by a stray fireplace log. Their fight was interrupted by the structure beginning to crumble. As the flaming debris dropped all around them, Andrea warned him of a coming danger. She stated,
"The Order did this to me. They killed who I was. They made me the Phantasm."
Unsure of what this meant, the Bat had to flee the burning structure. It seemed that Andrea met her own tragic demise. The Batman escaped, but he never saw Andrea or Thorne leave the home. In spite of this, Thorne's body was the only one found in the smoking wreckage later on. From that pivotal moment, Bruce Wayne, forever transformed by Andrea's presence and the lessons she imparted, understood a crucial truth. The Batman could not succumb to the depths of vengeance alone. The Phantasm's actions left a trail of bodies in her wake, a grim testament to the toll her quest had taken. It had quite literally consumed her. Bruce had to rise above personal vendettas and be more than a mere vigilante. With newfound resolve, the Batman would strive to bring balance and compassion to his crusade for justice, protecting the innocent without sacrificing his own humanity. The memory of Andrea Beaumont, the woman he had loved, would forever shape his mission as the Dark Knight. A constant reminder of the enduring power of love and the importance of preserving one's moral compass in the face of darkness. He tried to focus less on who she had become and more on who she had been. This gave him a renewed resolve in his crusade, but also an ominous fear. Her warning had struck him to the core, and he knew the worst was yet to come.
When I promised my parents at their graves that I would bring justice to Gotham, I had no idea what that would entail. The price I would have to pay.
A person who grew up in a place like Gotham would most likely be able to tell you all there is to know about the city. Its ups, its downs, the good and the bad. Thomas Elliot Jr. was no exception to this. One might even say he had an extensive history with Gotham City. His impact would leave a dark scar on Gotham for years. The Elliots had been founding members of Gotham alongside the Waynes and the Cobblepotts. Thomas's family was particularly close to the Wayne family as he was growing up. The Elliots were also distant relatives of the Waynes, and both Thomas Elliot Sr. and Thomas Wayne had been named after the same family friend. Bruce Wayne and Thomas Elliot were friends growing up. Their parents ran in the same social circles, so it only made sense that the two young boys would be friends. In spite of the outward appearance that the Elliots were wealthy, they actually held a dark secret. Even though they came from old money, their investments had actually dried up a long time ago. Any money they did have left, they spent trying to keep up appearances and continue their facade. They continued attending functions, appearing in the public eye, and wearing fashionable clothes, but in reality they were broke. This made life in the Elliot home very tense, fraught with worry, irritability, and oftentimes anger. None of this was helped by the fact that Thomas Elliot Sr. was a gambler. He was driven by compulsion and would frivolously waste away even more of their money. Thomas Elliot Jr. resented his father and saw him as responsible for their continued plight. In spite of his resentment towards his father, one of the few things Thomas Elliot Jr. did inherit from his father was a gambling habit. Thomas continued to rack up even more debt on top of his father's existing tally. Thomas did not see it as an addiction, however. In his mind, his father was just a loser, and he himself was a true gambler. In reality, he had become like his father. Even though this dark cloud loomed over him, Thomas was a very brilliant-minded young man. He worked extremely hard and proved his ambition. He earned a scholarship to college and eventually went on to enter medical school as well. With this education came a need for capital to pay his tuition. Thomas turned even harder to gambling to make his way. After watching his father lose so often, Thomas devised a plan. Rather than leave his fate to chance, he would do whatever he needed to win. First, he started off small. He used a loaded deck of cards for years to ensure he would win big. This helped him make it all the way through medical school. He went to a different school than Bruce, but the two remained in touch. Once Thomas had become a licensed surgeon, he became even bolder. He went as far as poisoning a fan-favorite racehorse to make sure it would drag its feet and lose the race. As time went on, and as Thomas became more experienced in his deception, he escalated even more. He wrapped his head in bandages to hide his identity. He then kidnapped a prize-fighter's wife and blackmailed him into taking a dive in the fight. Thomas's career as a doctor advanced, and he became one of the top doctors in Gotham. As his legitimate career advanced, so did his greed. Thomas found himself wanting more and more, not just the excitement of winning, but the thrill of the gamble. He finally escalated to murdering the parents of a professional baseball player, causing the player to miss the World Series and his team, the Gotham Knights, to lose. Nothing was beyond Thomas now. He would continue doing these things while keeping his involvement with them quiet. He would remain below the Batman's radar even as the vigilante first appeared in Gotham. Dr. Thomas Elliot remained a widely accepted public figure in Gotham, but kept his grim extracurricular activities hush-hush. Thomas became a sort of boogeyman in Gotham's criminal underworld. Street-level thugs would refer to him as Hush. He had kept his identity hidden by continuing to wear bandages covering his face, as well as a thick trench coat for protection. He formed connections to organized crime and quickly took over the operations of most gambling rings in Gotham. As Hush, he made a name for himself, almost as widely known as the Batman, but feared even more. Criminals would be even more scared to mention Hush's name lest they incur his wrath. This is why the Bat did not find out about him for a while. Thomas remained a confident and upstanding member of society with his well-respected name and reputation as a surgeon. Dr. Thomas Elliot paralleled Bruce Wayne and the Batman. They both were upstanding citizens of Gotham, and they both had a masked alter ego. In all of his criminal enterprises, it became glaringly evident to Thomas. With the Batman's sudden appearance, so too came Bruce Wayne's triumphant return to Gotham. Thomas and Bruce rekindled their friendship, with Thomas noting the similarities between them. After enough digging, it became clear to Thomas that Bruce was in fact the Batman. As Hush, Thomas had seen the Bat dismantle some of Hush's own work. This put them at odds with each other. Hush decided that in order to keep his operation running, he needed to dismantle the Bats. Using his knowledge of the Batman's identity, he used psychological tactics to throw him off. He left a photo of Thomas and Martha Wayne at one of his crime scenes, a letter between Bruce and his college sweetheart, Andrea, at another. Hush took cruel delight in seeing the Batman's startled reactions to these things. The Batman was filled with a torrent of emotions seeing these things: fear, confusion, rage. the Bat set out to discover who was behind this. Much of the ensuing conflict between Hush and the Batman remains lost to time, but what is known is that Hush was one of the Bat's most harrowing enemies. It truly pushed him to his limit to defeat the masked villain, and both the Vigilante and the city were shocked to discover the truth behind the wrappings. Dr. Thomas Elliot was the mastermind behind it all. It was a further blow to the Bat, yet another betrayal of his trust. Bruce and Thomas had been friends as children, and even as adults, for years. Bruce had his Bat team to rely on, but he had seen so many friends turn already. Harvey Dent had become Two-Face, Andrea had become the Phantasm, Silver St. Cloud had been in league with the Court of Owls. As Bruce approached the latter years of his time as the Batman, he began to become more paranoid. He was more wary of everyone, his allies included. He did not disband the Bat team, but he began to go on more solo patrols and missions, allowing his allies to operate autonomously. They all worried for Bruce, but they let him have this time to himself. Perhaps they should have supported him more, or perhaps that was what he needed. We may never know. Regardless of this, the time was fast approaching. The end of the Batman was drawing nearer and nearer, and Gotham would never be the same.
But now I'm tired. I don't know how much I have left to give this city.
The Great War brought forth many monsters in Gotham City. Two-Face was a product of Harvey Dent's downfall and injury. Laszlo Valentine had abandoned his faith and become the Pig because of the war. It was theorized that the Joker was a product of horrors and disfigurement on the battlefield. Among this number was a man named Temple Fugit. Temple had enlisted in the war to fight for his country. He wanted to protect the freedom of his fellow Americans. The gruesome sights he encountered changed his perspective very quickly. He saw death, fire, injuries beyond measure. The explosions rocked him to his core as he witnessed his fellow soldiers blasted apart by enemy artillery. The gas attacks brought an even slower and more painful end. Fugit was disillusioned. The freedom he sought for his countrymen seemed distant and unattainable. No philosophy of so-called freedom could be worth this, he thought. Fugit continued fighting in the Great War, but he returned to New York as a very different man. Gone were his illusions of fighting for freedom and his country. In their place was fury, trauma, and bitterness. Fugit saw people satisfied with living dull, dreary lives under the belief that it was because of their freedom. He also saw the corruption of both political parties in America and found it abhorrent. He felt like he was losing his mind in this environment and could take it no longer. Then, he discovered something that changed his life. Fugit discovered the writings and followers of Luigi Galliani, an Italian anarchist. Galliani believed that so-called heroism in the face of seeming capitalist oppression was necessary in the modern world. Galliani's idea of heroism, however, involved the construction and detonation of incendiary devices to instill terror. His followers were called Gallianists, and they sought to wreak havoc and terror throughout the country. They had been active as early as 1914. Fugit found his own worldview aligned very closely to these anarchists, and he joined their growing movement as soon as he had the chance. Fugit found himself acclimating to this group very well. He was an intelligent man, and he became one of their hardest-working members. He earned the nickname Clock King from his colleagues due to his aptitude for timers on his incendiary devices. Fugit and his colleagues were responsible for numerous explosions and deaths, but none so grievous as the Wall Street bombing. On September 16, 1920, a large explosion rocked Wall Street in New York. It claimed the lives of 30 individuals, with 10 more later dying from extensive injuries. Police were unable to discover those responsible, but suspected the Gallianists. It was believed that Temple Fugit and Professor Ettore Molinari were the key players involved in the terrorist attack. After this horrific event, Fugit left New York and moved to Gotham City. He wanted to distance himself from the attack, to avoid the authorities. Upon arriving in Gotham in 1921, Fugit found even more corruption and duplicity in its politicians and figureheads. He saw that organized crime was nearly indistinguishable from the authorities. Fugit started his own sect of the Galleonists here and immediately set to work. He continued using the moniker of Clock King. He thought it had a nice ring to it. He planned to set off explosions in various points in the city, but he devised a new type of incendiary device, one that could fit in a briefcase. He planned to leave these briefcases in various public locations, train stations, public parks, and even some government buildings. Fugit was ready to leave his mark on Gotham, but he didn't count on one thing: the recent appearance of the masked vigilante known as the Batman. The first explosion was small. It had no casualties and was located on a city street. Some people were injured and hospitalized, but there were no fatalities. A note was left nearby that read, "Yours sincerely, the Clock King." The police set to work, but so did the Batman. The Bat immediately investigated reports of other bombings in the country and found that all threads pointed back to the Galleonists. Another explosion rocked a public park, killing 5 people. There was debris left behind from the explosion, as well as another note. Using this evidence and the research he had done, the Batman scouted and observed locations likely to be targets. Fugit began to panic when his next explosion never went off. He went to investigate why and inadvertently put the Batman on his trail. When Fugit returned to his headquarters, the Bat was waiting there for him with handcuffs. Fugit's reign of terror had thankfully come to an end, before it had really begun. After Fugit's arrest, all of his prior work came to light. The authorities could not definitively tie him to the Wall Street bombing, but they had enough from the bombings in Gotham to put Fugit away. Due to public outcry, coupled with the evidence the authorities possessed, Fugit was sentenced to the electric chair. He'd spent his life working with timers and clockwork mechanisms, but Fugit could now only count down the seconds until the end. The Batman made his argument against this sentencing to Commissioner Gordon. The vigilante thought it was counterproductive to discovering who was behind the Wall Street bombing. In spite of this, they could not convince the prosecution. Fugit had already been provenly responsible for the deaths of 5 and the injury of countless others. In the end, the Batman's objections didn't matter. Fugit was still executed. While the Clock King was no longer a threat, his work would inspire terror during later events, during the short reign of another villain. The Bat would be hard-pressed to figure out who was behind this. Pulling on this thread would unravel a hidden plot, one that would engulf Gotham in chaos. Until then, the Batman closed his file on the Clock King and set his sights on protecting the city, which had already seen too much strife.
I think that I'm leaving Gotham in capable hands. I've prepared my team for this for years, for my retirement.
When the Great Depression hit America, Gotham did not fare much better than any other city in the United States. The reality for many revolved around just surviving. People would wait for hours in food lines to get a meal. Sometimes they had to resort to combing through trash just to find the tiniest morsel of rotten food. When the cold winters hit, all people could do was try to find shelter and hope that those nights would not be their last. This was the reality for countless in America, and this was the reality for a young boy named Lonnie Mackin in Gotham City. Lonnie had his mother, father, and sister. They helped each other to get by, and Lonnie's mother encouraged Lonnie especially to learn to read, teaching him herself. School was considered a luxury to most during the height of the Depression. She would bring home any book she could get her hands on, fairy tales, mathematics, and even political texts. These books were often old and worn, but no matter the subject, Lonnie devoured this reading material. When Lonnie reached the age of 16, his mother and sister contracted and died from a small Spanish flu outbreak. The Spanish flu pandemic had ended years prior, but still became problematic in low-income homes and crowded living areas. Lonnie's mother and sister were just 2 of the unlucky few to contract it. These deaths absolutely broke the young boy, and it sank his father into a depression. Before long, Lonnie's father had drunk himself into an early grave. Lonnie was now alone in the world, and the world was terrifying. The one thing that kept Lonnie going was a book his mother had given him. She had found countless assorted things for him to read, but this one was different. It impacted Lonnie on a deeper level. It was like a Bible to him. This text was Faccia a faccia col nemico, or Face to Face with the Enemy, by the Italian anarchist Luigi Galliani. Galliani was the same man who had inspired Temple Fugit, the Clock King, years earlier. This text embraced the term propaganda of the deed, which justified violence as a catalyst for revolution. Lonnie had seen so much unfairness and injustice in his lifetime. The words in this book simply made sense to him. The imbalance of power and wealth was evident to him. All around, Lonnie saw the poor suffering as a result of the mistakes of the rich. It made him angry, resentful, and bitter. He wanted someone to pay for the injustice happening in Gotham every day. His own family had been impacted by these very mistakes, and Lonnie wanted it to be made right. The corruption in Gotham made it clear to him that he would seemingly never find justice through conventional means. Lonnie wanted change, justice, vengeance. Lonnie wanted anarchy. The change that Lonnie wanted obviously couldn't come from just him. He was only 16 years old. He had seen and heard enough about the masked vigilantes and criminals in Gotham to reach a realization. If he wanted to make change happen, he would need a symbol to accompany his ideals. A symbol or moniker would give him a stake in the game being played by those colorful individuals. Lonnie knew that if he could establish himself as a player in this game of masks, even Gotham's press would be interested in his motivations and mission. He became obsessed with this idea and began formulating plans. He took major inspiration from the Clock King's horrendous exploits and learned anything and everything he could about constructing incendiary devices. As a child, he had read to sharpen his mind and foster creativity. Now he read to bring about destruction and mayhem. Lonnie set his eyes on those who he deemed responsible for the plight of the common citizens of Gotham, the rich and wealthy. Chief amongst his targets was the one who had helped pull Gotham out of the Great Depression, Bruce Wayne. Wayne Enterprises had been instrumental in aiding Gotham through the company's ventures and diversification. In spite of this, Lonnie believed that Bruce was a prime example of everything that was wrong with society. Bruce Wayne had been handed an easy life on a silver platter, and Lonnie had scrounged for scraps in the streets. Bruce Wayne had been handed a fortune to do whatever he pleased with. Lonnie had been poor his whole life. Lonnie surmised that there must be others who felt similarly about Bruce Wayne. He believed that taking down Bruce Wayne was the match that would light the fires of revolution in Gotham City. And so, Lonnie prepared. He began circulating word of his planned revolution using the moniker Anarky. He donned a black outfit, hat, and a mask to hide his true identity. No one could ever know that he was merely a teenager if he hid his true face. He began passing out pamphlets and works of his own, preparing incendiary devices for his inevitable rise to prominence, and even gaining a small following to aid him in these tasks. Many people had been slighted in the Great Depression. Stirring the societal pot proved a fairly easy task to Anarky. Anarky's plans would not come to fruition for some time, but he would make a name for himself. Whispers were heard and the police kept vigilant. They had heard rumors of a resurgence similar to the Clock King attacks and did not want to take any chances. Anarky reveled in the game that he had so quickly become a player in. He was excited to bring a new era to Gotham City, one of chaos, confusion, and, in his own mind, justice. Unfortunately for him, Anarky would not get to see much of the fruit of his labors. In fact, his reign would be relatively short-lived. During the events of the Knightfall, Anarky would only be a minor player in a different game altogether. Chaos would indeed reign in Gotham, but it would not be under the reign of Lonnie Mackin.
It's time for me to leave Gotham in different hands now. It's time for the bat to end.
When adversity strikes regular people, it can cause many different reactions. Some people complain about their lot in life, others just push through and carry on. In some cases, it can push someone over the edge. In the case of Stephanie Brown, adversity caused her to step up and don the identity of the spoiler. In the case of Tim Drake, who saw unrest in Gotham City, it pushed him to deduce the Batman's identity and become the third person to take up the mantle of Robin. These two unlikely heroes would eventually be pushed together to face even more adversity. This would give them the chance to break off from the shadow of the Bat and come into their own. This was something that both Tim and Stephanie wanted, a chance to prove to Gotham and themselves that they had what it took to protect the city. This also came with its own complications and challenges, its own dangers and evils. Tim Drake had been Robin up until the events of the Shadow War. With the revelation of Bruce Wayne's biological son, Damian, it became clear that Damian wanted a hand in helping bring Ra's al Ghul to justice. Tim saw the fire burning within Damian and graciously stepped aside to let the boy become the fourth Robin. With this decision, Tim found himself in need of a new moniker. He initially took up the name Red Robin in his fight against crime, and he used this up until the end of the Shadow War. After those harrowing events, he felt hollow. So much death and loss, and his new moniker wasn't really new. It was a rehash of his previous one. It was a reminder of those battles and all that death and loss. When the spoiler joined the Bat team, a lot of things changed for Tim. He found a kindred spirit in Stephanie, and she in him. The more they patrolled together, the more clear it became that they worked very well together as a team. Both of their analytical minds made them a perfect crime-fighting duo. Together, Tim and Stephanie came up with a new moniker for Tim. He let go of his past alter ego as Robin and changed his vigilante code name to Red Wing. It signified a sort of taking flight with his crime-fighting career. They crafted a new uniform for him as well. It incorporated elements of his previous one, but also more protective. It resembled the Batman's uniform in some ways too, but Tim found a way to make it his own. With an earless cowl, a utility bandolier and belt, and a fresh mindset, he set out feeling like a new hero. Both the spoiler and the Red Wing set out to seek out criminality and put a stop to it, whatever it might be. Things went very well at first. The rest of the Bat team had nothing but praise for the two as they dispensed justice in Gotham. Bruce Wayne had started easing back on his patrols as the Batman. He was tired and he was relying on his comrades more and more. The Bat would often warn them not to become too used to victory. He had seen that mentality go awry more often than he cared to remember. The Red Wing and the spoiler took this to heart. While seeking independence from the Bat's shadow, they still mostly respected the advice he had to give, even if there was still an occasional feeling of annoyance or exasperation. As it would soon turn out, this advice would come to both of their minds quite often in coming months. With the appearance of villains such as Professor Pig and the Calendar Man, a new breed of criminal was starting to rise, not just in Gotham, but in America. It would take all of the Red Wings and the Spoiler's skills combined to combat it. Even then, it would not be enough, and they would have to turn to a former enemy for assistance. With danger on all sides, the Red Wing and the Spoiler would have to rely heavily on each other. This was the only way they could come out on the other side of this conflict, unscathed. With Gotham running rampant with costumed criminals, the Bat team would be stretched thin. The Batman would have to become more active, putting aside his physical tiredness and mental exhaustion. It would be a harrowing time for the Bat team. At times, the darkness looming over Gotham would seem unbearable. Only by relying on each other and the people of Gotham would they emerge victorious from this prevalent darkness. In the meantime, the Red Wing and the Spoiler would continue their own crusade unhindered and blissfully unaware of what was to come.
And so I'm leaving this message. I want my final words to be this.
During the Wall Street crash of 1929, many felt that they had lost everything. While businessmen jumping from buildings was more of a widespread rumor than fact, there were still an unfortunate few who did tragically make that choice. One such affected person was one Victor Zsasz. Zsasz was an investor in all sorts of mercantile dealings, and the stock market crash devastated him and countless others. He felt an extremely intense despair at this news and decided to jump from his office building. He shared a building with a lawyer and a few other businessmen. When he arrived at the 7th-story ledge of the office, he was shocked to see another man already standing there. The man was older and a familiar face. The man's name was George Carver, a 65-year-old owner of a wholesale produce firm. They had business dealings in the past. Carver was clearly distraught. Zsasz thought that he didn't want to go through with it. Something snapped within Zsasz at that moment. His intense despair turned into an intense, empty pit in his stomach. He felt a coldness and a resolve rise within him as he walked up behind the man. Zsasz approached the open window behind the ledge. Carver turned to look at him just in time to see Zsasz push him gently. Carver toppled off the ledge and impacted an automobile on the street below. Zsasz left hurriedly, taking to the streets of New York. He did not know why this urge had risen within him, but he knew something for sure. He wanted to feel that rush again. Years later, a string of murders began in Gotham City. The victims were often found either having fallen from high places or with their throats slashed by a straight razor. Police were stumped and could not find enough of a pattern to determine the identity of the killer. In a time before criminal profiling, law enforcement was stumped. They turned to the Bat team for assistance. Red Wing and the Spoiler took on the case, finding it suited to their skill sets. With the recent appearance of spree killers like Professor Pig and the Calendar Man, Red Wing and Spoiler felt that there was a new type of criminal surfacing in Gotham. In order to gain an understanding of what they were up against, they turned first to their allies. They got some helpful information from their allies, but most of them were handling cases of their own. Even the files from previous cases weren't much help to the duo. They were missing a key element: how to get inside the mind of the killer they were tracking. With the realization of this missing element, Red Wing and Spoiler turned to an unlikely source for assistance. They went to Blackgate Penitentiary and sought out the one man who could give them insight into the killer. They went to Edward Nygma, the Riddler. The years had not been kind to Nygma. He had been assigned to the caretaking of the prison library. His anger and resentment at being incarcerated had seemingly boiled down to nothing but boredom. This boredom was suddenly alleviated with the arrival of these two visitors. Nygma listened to the case and gladly gave his insight to Red Wing and the Spoiler. This collaboration between Red Wing, the Spoiler, and the Riddler laid some of the groundwork for what would later become criminal profiling. It would be referenced and taught by law enforcement for years to come. Armed with fresh insights into the mind of a killer, Red Wing and the Spoiler determined some tentative details about the killer they were tracking. The killer was likely not from Gotham, as the murders had only begun recently, and bore similarity to some murders in New York. The killer was likely a man. His murders bore characteristics of multiple other male murderers in Gotham and other cities. The killer was also an impulse killer. The pool of his victims seemed to hold no specific pattern to them. They also determined that he might collect trophies of some kind, mementos of his kills. These analyses were all made with the help of Edward Nygma and were instrumental in helping locate the killer. After one final session with Nygma, Red Wing and the Spoiler had a mostly complete profile of their spree killer. They set out to find a suspect. The murders took place in the Tri-Corner district, so the masked vigilantes staked it out in the following days. After hours and hours of waiting, their patience paid off. An individual attacked someone in the street late one night. Red Wing and the Spoiler confronted the man, but were not prepared for the grisly sight that turned to face them. The man was covered from head to toe in scars, all making crude tally marks across his flesh. The man's eyes had a fire of desperation and madness to them as he yelled and charged at them with a knife. The two vigilantes took the man down after a brief battle. After bringing him to the authorities, they learned that his name was Victor Zsasz. Zsasz claimed that each tally mark on his skin was a kill, a poor soul who needed freeing from the pain of existence. Redwing and the Spoiler were disgusted with Zsasz and his twisted ideologies. Before they could do much else, they received word suddenly. There was an escape attempt happening at Blackgate Penitentiary. During his interviews with Redwing and the Spoiler, Edward Nygma had been plotting. He was bored with the monotony of prison life and tired of being constrained. By being cooperative, he had lowered the guards of the costume vigilantes. In doing so, and by exhibiting good behavior, he had also lulled the guards into a false sense of security. After Nygma's final session with Redwing and the Spoiler, he swiped a guard's key as they led him back to his cell. He freed his hands and strangled the guard to death. He swapped uniforms with the guard and exited the visiting area. As guards rushed past him into the room, Nygma walked right past them towards freedom. Alarm bells sounded and Nygma exited the penitentiary. He moved towards an unattended prison vehicle as rain began to fall. Nygma began fiddling with the lock on the door of the car. He managed to open it, just as a voice sounded out above him. Looking to the roof of the vehicle, he saw Red Robin crouched on top of it. The Spoiler stepped up behind him. Nygma begrudgingly put his hands up as the two apprehended him once again. While Nygma may have been a threat, he had helped the vigilantes put an even bigger one behind bars. Zsasz, now in police custody, stood trial for the murders he had committed. Being deemed criminally insane, he was sentenced to Arkham Asylum. Many called for the death penalty, but the judge stood firm on the sentencing. Zsasz was too unstable. Redwing and the Spoiler would continue building rapport as crime fighters. Years later, the work they had done developing a profile on Zsasz would influence the behavioral science unit's approach in the FBI. The events of this case would also inspire author Thomas Harris to write the book, The Silence of the Lambs. Redwing and the Spoiler had brought a killer to justice, and Gotham thanked them for it. The city was safe again, for now.
Never give up, even when the fight seems lost.
Centuries before Gotham City was established, another conflict was arising between medieval Europe and what was then known by many as the Holy Land. After the First Crusade, Jerusalem was under relative Christian control, and many pilgrims began traveling back to it from Europe. Outside of the city, however, pilgrims were constantly beset by bandits and highwaymen. These pilgrims were oftentimes slaughtered by the hundreds on their journey to the city. This led to the formation of a monastic religious group dedicated to the protection of these pilgrims. This order was called the Knights Templar and was formed in the year 1119. This group quickly rose to prominence in feudal Europe. They had the support of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, whose uncle had been a founding member of the Templars. This aided their popularity and finances. In 1129, they were officially recognized by the Roman Catholic Church. This endorsement led to an even larger amount of finances, resources, and members. In 1139, the Templars were exempted from adherence to local laws by Pope Innocent II. This allowed them to pass borders freely and not pay local taxes in their travels. Because of this rapid growth and impunity from most laws, the Templars became the advanced troops for most battles in the following Crusades. Their non-combatant members were also important, pioneering banking and financial techniques throughout Christendom. The Templars continued influencing these events at least until the 1300s. By then, a darkness had begun to seep into the mention of their name. With the rapid growth of the order, there were rumors and superstitions around them. Some claimed that certain sects were holding arcane initiation ceremonies, others that they had committed rampant injustices throughout the Holy Land due to their papal immunity. King Philip the Fair of France had risen to the throne in 1268. On Friday, October 13th of 1307, the king stated, "God is not pleased. We have enemies of the faith in the kingdom." King Philip had been consolidating power over nobility and the church, wanting the French monarchy to be uncontested in any regard. He forced the hand of Pope Clement V into allowing the arrest, torture, and eventual disbanding of the Knights Templar in 1312. During these arrests and trials, many of the Templars were forced into the admission of worshipping idols, corruption, fraud, and secrecy. Most of these admissions were made under torture and therefore mostly false. This still caused a massive scandal in Europe. While these admissions remained mostly unfounded, some claimed that it was not the Templars as a whole responsible for these allegations, but instead one small sect of it. This sect within the Templars was known as the Sacred Order of Saint Dumas. It was a relatively small group led by a man named Dumas. Dumas was a self-proclaimed saint that gained adherents through secrecy, corruption, and promises of a transformed world. Many speculate that this sect was responsible for secret initiation ceremonies, assassinations, and undisclosed reallocation of funds entrusted to the Templars. With the alleged confessions extracted from certain members of the Templars, Pope Clement disbanded the Knights Templar on March 22, 1312. Just like that, a massive part of medieval European infrastructure was suddenly gone. This led to many rumors and legends around the Templars, perpetuated throughout the centuries. The Sacred Order of Saint Dumas disappeared into the shadows, but they did not disband. Some speculate that they were somehow responsible for the death of King Philip the Fair in the year 1314. The order used their knowledge of secrecy and finance to continue their work for hundreds of years. They persisted in darkness. By the 1900s, much had changed within the Sacred Order of Saint Dumas. They were now led by a man named Nomaz. They were certainly smaller than they had been at the start, but they had maintained a certain level of wealth and secrecy. The Order's mission had evolved. They now sought to shape history however they could to fit their needs. They accomplished this through centuries of cultivating a specific bloodline within their ranks. This bloodline was put through a rigorous training program and then, upon graduation, granted the title of Azrael. Azrael acted as the hands and feet of the Order, carrying out their will in the world however they saw fit. This breeding and training program was known by members of the Order as the System. This had worked for them for hundreds of years, and in the 1920s to 1930s, took form in a man named Jean-Paul Valley. Valley was the latest in his bloodline to take up the mantle of Azrael. His father and grandfather before him had been Azrael as well, with the title going all the way back to medieval times. One of the Order's rival organizations was the League of Assassins, led by Ra's al Ghul. When Valley stepped forward as Azrael to assist the Bat Team in the Shadow War, they assumed that he was another masked vigilante fighting for Gotham. In actuality, Nomaz had learned of the League's plans in Gotham and dispatched Azrael to assist the Bat Team. In the wake of the Shadow War, it became evident just how valuable Gotham had been to the League of Assassins. Both Nomaz and the Order now saw the value in furthering their interests there. They instructed Azrael to maintain cover and continue to be an ally to the Bat Team. From the Batman's perspective, he thought Azrael seemed a bit odd, but allowed his allies to continue working with him when their interests aligned. To the Bat, Azrael had proven himself numerous times, even if he was reserved. The Order continued operating as they always had, in secrecy, from the shadows. Jean-Paul Valley had almost never experienced life outside of the Order. His entire experience had been within the religious sect. All he knew was the system, Nomaz's decrees, and the history that had been taught to him. Upon experiencing the battles and intensity of the Shadow War, Valley's outlook on life was a lot more serious, but also more hopeful. The more he worked with the Batman, Robin, Nightwing, Redwing, Spoiler, and the Black Bat, the more he aspired to be like them. He wanted to fulfill the instructions of the Order, but he also wanted to find his own fulfillment. He often found these two things conflicting with one another. The Order had taught him to avoid worldliness and desire, but his so-called worldly allies brought out the best in him. Without telling the Batman the full story of his upbringing, Azrael asked the vigilante for advice on this. The Bat told Azrael that regardless of what he had been raised to believe, Azrael had to do what he believed to be the right thing. Azrael took this to heart. That interaction impacted the Batman, too. The Bat had seen the progress Azrael had made in aiding them. Crime had plummeted in recent months. The Batman, tired and burnt out, was thinking of extending an offer to Azrael. This interaction, and subsequent ones, convinced him that he was making the right choice. Much would change in Gotham soon, and both Azrael and the Batman would be at the center of it. A new foe would arrive in Gotham, and he would not only mentally break the Bat, but would also break him physically. The fall of the Dark Knight was imminent, and Gotham would see unprecedented chaos.
Trust in yourself, even when you are filled with doubt.
In the grand scheme of history, sometimes the smallest choices can have the biggest consequences. This was definitely the case for Edmund Dorrance, otherwise known by his alias King Snake. Decades before becoming the leader of the fearsome ghost dragons, Dorrance had worked for another cruel institution. The corrupt government of Mexico had employed his mercenary prowess prior to the Mexican Civil War. Dorrance was tasked with finding, torturing, and killing the enemies of the government at any cost. Dorrance grew in apathy, cruelty, and reputation through this vile work. In spite of this darkness, there was one light in Dorrance's life. An indigenous woman that he fell in love with and married in Santa Prisca, Mexico. They had children together, and Dorrance showed a tenderness to them that no one else experienced from the mercenary. Most people who had the misfortune of meeting King Snake met a swift end. His family knew only seeming affection from him. When the Mexican Civil War began, Dorrance fled the country in exile. He showed his true colors and did this knowing full well the consequences. To make an example of his betrayal, the government imprisoned his wife and children on the prison island of Peña Duro. Over the course of many years, Dorrance's wife and most of his children are believed to have perished. Peña Duro was a hellhole of a prison, and only the strongest survived. One of Dorrance's children fought tooth and claw to survive. This child honed himself physically and mentally, any chance that he could find. His rage was what kept him going, hate for those around him and for his father who had left him to die. With no formal education, he sought knowledge from the other inmates around him. Every fight that he found himself in was a combat lesson. Every conversation was an opportunity to learn a number of languages. He learned the art of lucha libre wrestling and excelled at it. Dorrance's sole surviving son showed the others around him that he would never back down, and that he was a force to be reckoned with. He achieved this by breaking the spirit of his enemies, as well as their bones. He outsmarted his rivals at every turn due to his sharp mind. By the time the child had reached the age of 17, he was a battle-hardened weapon. This living hell that he had grown up in had been his crucible. He earned a name for himself in Peña Duro due to his tenacity and resilience. He crafted a mask for himself like a luchador. It was like a rebirth for him. No one could best him, and so his name was Bane. Just when Bane thought he had risen to the top, Peña Duro found a new way to crush its inmates' spirits. Life was cheap here, and the government had interests of their own. Foreign scientists were allowed entry to the prison, their minds set on experimentation. The inmates were unsure of what exactly was being tested, but the fear and tension it created was palpable. Inmates were taken to laboratories and would not return. Many assumed that they were dead. Bane was not afraid, however. He was enraged at the scientists. These scientists continued conducting cruel tests and experiments. Years later, their actions would be likened to those of Japanese Unit 731 and the German human experiments during World War II. The compound that these scientists were testing proved deadly to almost everyone they used it on. It was an enhancement steroid that they hoped would improve the performance of soldiers in combat. Inmate after inmate was exposed to the compound. Some died screaming in pain, others died silently, choking on their own blood. The compound earned the nickname Venom from the inmates due to its deadly nature. Eventually, even Bane was experimented on. They exposed him to the Venom compound, and it was the single most excruciating experience of his life. Bane felt as if fire burned in his veins. There were many times when he felt that he was near his end, but his rage would reignite, and he would push through. In the end, he was the only survivor, and he was the experiment's only success. Unbeknownst to the scientists, Bane had been observing and taking note of how the Venom compound was made. With his newfound strength, Bane broke out of the facility and murdered everyone working on the production and experimentation of Venom. Chaos ensued, and as Peña Duro burned, Bane found himself smiling in triumph. Even those who sought to put him in his place had failed. The experiments and the Venom had awoken a new desire within him, to test his power against worthy opponents. Bane started his own production of Venom, enlisting some of the former inmates who had escaped with him. He spent the following years seeking out foes and destroying them, breaking them mentally and physically. Bane did not care who he murdered, ravaged, or crushed. All he cared about was the power that Venom gave him. The one person who eluded Bane was the person who had initially sparked this hatred within him, his father, King Snake. Bane looked for any information he could regarding his father, but to no avail. It was only when he learned of Dorance's death in prison that he knew where his father had been. Months after the events of the Shadow War, Bane turned his sights on Gotham City. He sought to test the mettle of the so-called heroes that had bested his father and the League of Assassins. Gotham would have its reckoning, and Bane would break the Bat, body and soul.
Trust in your family, no matter what may come. The family I've found has had my back more times than I care to count. If you keep these things in mind, nothing the world throws at you will keep you down. My last words to you are, have hope, take heart. Goodbye, Gotham.
After years and years of trying to fight injustice and corruption in Gotham, the Batman felt as though he was failing. He had dismantled organized crime in the city. He had defeated the Court of Owls, an evil cabal of Gotham's rich and powerful. He had led his allies in battle against the League of Assassins and came out the Shadow War alive. In spite of this, the Batman had sustained injuries from those battles that had never fully healed. He could feel the physical toll within himself. Even after all of these victories, the Bat saw Gotham continue to spew forth enemies and so-called supervillains. Bruce pushed himself every day to continue fighting his crusade, but he gradually began to rely more and more on his allies. He allowed the Bat team to take on more patrols, fight more villains, and have more autonomy from himself. Bruce could see that his protégés were becoming more capable with each passing day, and he could not help but feel a spark of pride seeing them all come into their own. Much of Bruce's time as the Bat was spent overseeing cases, going on patrols, and training his biological son, Damian. He had taken special care to work with Damian in unlearning everything the boy had been taught in the League of Assassins. Damian showed a lot of promise, and Bruce wanted to teach him everything he could before the physical toll became too much. Bruce worried that his injuries might keep him from continuing as the Bat if they worsened. He worried about a bigger enemy rising that he would not be able to face. In 1937, his fears began to come true. A new street drug by the nickname of Venom began circulating in Gotham. It caused individuals either to die or go on violent rampages. The Batman tried to learn where it had originated, but all of the dealers and criminals pushing it were too terrified to answer, even to the Bat. In the meantime, the Batman met with the Bat team and prioritized dismantling the drug operation. He instructed them to stop Venom distribution while he focused on finding the source of its production. After weeks of taking down Venom operations, the Batman was no closer to finding out who had started the distribution. It was not through lack of trying. The criminals and dealers he confronted had either jumped off of roofs or been shot by their comrades rather than give up any information about their leader. The Batman saw not just fear, but a desperation in these people. It haunted him how similar it was to his own effect on the criminals in Gotham. It was not until the Batman took down a specific operation in the dockyards that he learned anything at all. Confronting the head of this specific operation, the Bat learned that his name was Barsad. Barsad's men were openly using his name and asking for instructions. Barsad and the Batman traded blows in a heated exchange, but the man was no match for the seasoned vigilante. Standing over his fallen foe, the Batman threatened to break Barsad's arm unless he told him the name of his boss. Barsad merely laughed at him. The Batman applied more pressure and the man continued laughing. Barsad barely even reacted when the Bat broke his arm. The criminal merely turned and spat at the vigilante, stating, "It's too late. Bane will break the Bat." The Batman restrained the criminals and called in the police. He left before they could arrive. Tensions were high between Gotham and the Batman at present. Not long after the police arrived and began arresting Barsad and his men, protesters also began to arrive. The Batman looked on in grim silence, seeing the signs. Arrest the Bat. Badges, not capes. No more vigilante justice. Before leaving, the Batman thought to himself about all he had done for the city, but knowing that he had betrayed its trust during the Shadow War. All things come to an end, and the goodwill of the city towards him had dissipated. Even though he had not found the leader of this drug operation in Gotham, the Batman now had a name. He looked anywhere he could to find reports, articles, and evidence of this Bane figure's existence. All he found were scraps of correspondence from an island called Santa Prisca in the Caribbean. These reports spoke of a man hell-bent on destroying his enemies and burning villages to the ground. With each word that he read, the Bat could feel a dread creeping into his mind. He worried that this was an enemy that would prove to be too much for the Bat team. After learning this, he received word from Nightwing. The Venom operation's main distribution location had been discovered. Bruce called each of his allies and told them to stand down and await instruction. He wanted to face this alone. He needed this to prove to himself that he still had what it took to protect Gotham City. And so, the Bat set out to stop Bane once and for all. When he walked into the building that Nightwing had directed him to, the Batman was greeted with only darkness. He proceeded forward with caution, only to be blinded by lights suddenly flooding the room. He saw a large open chamber filled with laboratory equipment. He knew immediately that this was where Venom was being created. A lone figure stood at the center of the chamber watching him. As the Batman approached, he saw the crossbones on the man's mask, the rippling muscles beneath flesh, and the vials of venom strapped to the man's belt. The Bat and Bane measured each other up as Bane injected himself with a vial of venom. The Bat dodged to the side as Bane ran at him, the criminal roaring with an almost animalistic rage. The two exchanged blows and both inflicted numerous injuries on each other. The Batman could see that Bane had continued to inject himself with venom periodically. He surmised that Bane had become so resistant to it that he needed it in numerous concentrated doses, quite frequently. With renewed vigor, he ran forward with his brass-knuckle battering and sliced Bane's belt from his waist, smashing the vials on the ground. Bane, utterly enraged, grabbed the Batman and bodily raised the vigilante above his head. The Batman realized in that split second that he had made a mistake, a misjudgment in his own physical capabilities. Bane brought the Batman's back down over his knee. With a crack, the Bat's back was broken. Bane roared in triumph, but it was cut short with a cough. Bane began to stagger, and his mask became soaked with blood. He fell to the ground, motionless. This was the last thing the Bat saw before drifting into unconsciousness. Bruce awoke in Wayne Manor in severe pain. He was wrapped in bandages and could barely move at all. Dick Grayson and an ailing Alfred were present and attending him. Bruce tried to sit up but was immediately met with excruciating pain. Dick helped Bruce get more comfortable and informed him of the events following his battle with Bane. The Bat team had moved into attack after not receiving word and took down any straggling members of Bane's operation. When they found Bane and the Bat, they were terrified that both were dead. Dick informed Bruce that Bane had broken his back, but that it could have been much worse. Dick and Alfred were optimistic that rehabilitation was possible, but would only provide limited physical capabilities back to him. Bane had suffered from a severe stroke. His dependence on venom had finally caught up to him, and Bane was now catatonic in Blackgate Federal Penitentiary. He was under extreme observation and evaluation by authorities. Bane had broken the Bat's body, but now Bruce felt his spirit beginning to break too. He asked Dick and Alfred to make arrangements to begin his rehabilitation. As they took their leave, Bruce began to think. He thought long and hard about everything that had transpired. Not just Bane, but all of it. After thinking for hours, he decided to put a plan into action. He decided that he was done being the Batman. After his battle with Bane, Bruce Wayne was beaten down and defeated. His back had been broken, and the physical toll he had already been experiencing worsened. He now had difficulty breathing, chest pain, and his reflexes were all but non-existent. After a few weeks of limited rehabilitation, he forced himself to walk for brief periods of time with the use of a cane. Even then, he could only stay upright for a few minutes before excruciating pain forced him off of his feet. Bruce discreetly used his wealth and resources to see the best doctors and physicians, but his recovery was still limited. He could not don the cowl of the Bat again in his current state. Bruce's allies urged him to take the time to recuperate. Many of them were pained to see him in such anguish. Bruce had been a bastion of perseverance and a rock for most of them. Bruce thought to himself that maybe the things that they were saying were a sign. Maybe it was time for him to retire from being the Batman. And so, with Alfred's help, Bruce began making preparations to leave Gotham. He had heard of various alternative rehabilitation techniques in his travels, and he aimed to seek them out. He planned to seek these treatments for as long as they would take. Bruce may have been retiring from the mantle of the Batman, but he also knew how much of a symbolic figure he had become. Even though the city had turned on him, he knew that there might still come a time when Gotham needed that symbol again. Bruce surmised that he not only needed to step down, but needed to select an heir to the legacy of the Bat. The Batman needed a successor. Bruce evaluated each member of the Bat team to see if their capabilities matched what he envisioned in a successor. Nightwing was the most experienced of his allies. He had been the first Robin and had more than proven himself. To Bruce, the only flaw with choosing Nightwing was one that Bruce had to be critical about. He had not seen the drive and physical capabilities to match Bruce's own. The Red Hood was another option. He had the drive and the physical capabilities and the combat prowess. Given Jason's own struggles, however, Bruce worried that Jason would be tempted to give in to the violence and instability that the League of Assassins had drilled into him. Bruce evaluated his other allies too, the Black Bat, Red Wing, the Spoiler, the Batwoman. The problem he encountered was the lack of experience or the previous factors he had taken into account. Out of all these individuals, only one stood out to him. While having not been an ally for very long, Azrael seemed the best candidate to Bruce. The warrior had shown a similar drive and commitment to truth and justice. Azrael had proven this to Bruce in sharing some details about his life and seeking honesty over secrecy. He had also proven his efficiency in combat. Azrael had helped contribute to a decrease in crime in Gotham, and had also aided them in taking down Bane's criminal operation. Above all of that, Azrael showed great potential and willingness to learn from the Batman. After weighing all of these factors, Bruce made the decision to approach Azrael and ask him to be Bruce's successor. Bruce realized that it didn't matter who wore the mask, so long as they had met the right criteria and fulfilled the role. Azrael accepted with great humility and deference to Bruce, vowing to uphold justice in Gotham and bring honor to the title of the Bat. A good number of Bruce's allies in the Bat team were opposed to this, or reluctant to accept it at the very least. Nightwing tried to back up Bruce's decision to the others, but even he wasn't entirely confident in it. With preparations made, Bruce bade his friends and family farewell. He specifically instructed Damian to keep training and listen to everything Alfred and the others instructed him to do. Nightwing was sad to see his mentor and father figure leave, even if they had disagreements at times. Oracle and Bruce reminisced about his actions inspiring to join this fight. Jason thanked Bruce for bringing him back from the brink and teaching him compassion and kindness. The others watched Bruce, the man who had started this whole journey for them, take his well-earned leave. In 1937, Bruce traveled to Europe, and Azrael became the Batman. For the next 2 years, Azrael donned a new uniform to reflect his role. He wore a mask resembling a combination of his own and the Batman's, and altered his armor with a bat symbol. The Bat team continued operating as they had. Azrael thought it was important to leave room for the old tactics and strategies. He also brought his own to the table, using his experience with the system and the Sacred Order of Saint Dumas to enhance their current operation. After about a year, he had more confidence from the Bat team than he did previously. Nightwing and Oracle did not fully approve of Azrael's tactics as the Bat. He was more brutal than Bruce had been, while finding the balance of not being lethal. The Red Hood approved of this brutality, however. Jason thought it was a vast improvement on taking criminals down and keeping them down without killing them. It seemed that crime was at an all-time low, until the explosions began. The first was at a train station. It killed 5 people and injured 3 more. The authorities discovered a haunting echo of the past at the scene, debris resembling an incendiary device created by Temple Fugit, the Clock King. There was one discrepancy, however. A red letter A was burned into a part of the briefcase. Police did not know what to make of it, but the Bat team had been observing evidence of a rising force in Gotham. Word had spread amongst Gotham's citizens of the mysterious figure known as Anarky. 2 days later, another explosion happened in the district of Gotham where Bruce Wayne had helped oversee and fund the restoration of the city. Over the course of these attacks, the Bat family saw something change within Azrael. He became vengeful, angry, and became possessed with a grim resolve. He cited rhetoric about his sacred duty to uphold justice and bring those responsible to bear. The Bat team found these statements odd, but then again, Azrael was still a bit odd to them. For Azrael, it wasn't hard to track down the person responsible for these explosions. Lonnie Mackin, aka Anarky. Azrael, Nightwing, and Robin went to confront the aspiring supervillain. They found him in an old, defunct, and crumbling courthouse in the Narrows. Anarky set his followers on the trio, but they were no match for the vigilantes. Just as the battle seemed won, Nightwing and Robin turned to see Azrael standing in front of Anarky. Anarky pulled a knife and tried to stab the new Batman, but Azrael was too quick. He knocked the blade from Anarky's hand and gripped him in a headlock. Nightwing and Robin watched in horror as Azrael snapped the boy's neck in front of them. Lonnie Mackin survived having his neck broken by Azrael, but was kept in critical condition in Gotham Hospital. He was paralyzed from the neck down, very similar to the condition of a member of the Bat team. Oracle in particular was infuriated with Azrael, claiming that he had crossed the line, the very one Joker had crossed years ago, and Bane had crossed recently. The Red Hood defended Azrael, stating that the new Batman had no choice. Anarky had been killing people in acts of terror. Nightwing interjected, stating that Bruce would never have gone that far. He warned Azrael that if he ever did anything like that again, he would take him down and turn him in. Azrael, fully given over to his brutal training and brainwashing from the system, accused them all of questioning his sacred right and duty to protect Gotham. He told them that he took Bruce's decision seriously, and that if he did not have their support, he would set out on his own. Azrael left the Bat Team and continued operating on his own. He went back to the Sacred Order of Saint Dumas, where they gave him the resources he needed. Nightwing and the others kept close observation on him when they could, but Azrael proved effective at hiding, even from them. The Bat Team continued fighting crime, but they and the new Batman left each other alone. In 1939, almost 2 years since Bruce's departure from Gotham, another incident occurred, this one even more horrendous than the last. Harvey Dent, aka Two-Face, having escaped Arkham in the wake of the Shadow War, began a new crime spree. Gotham found itself facing terror again, worried about encountering the criminal in the streets. The Bat Team worked hard to try and find Dent, and eventually did, but the new Batman beat them to it. The Bat Team arrived at Two-Face's hideout located at 250 52nd Street. It was in an old warehouse. Half of the building had been scorched by a fire years ago, and it fit Dent's criteria of duality. Upon entering, they saw a mangled corpse on the ground. As they approached it, they could see the suit on the body, one perfectly split down the middle in 2 patterns. The clothing had been slashed in numerous places, with the largest wounds being 2 directly at the center of the victim's back. It was the body of Harvey Dent, alias Two-Face. The Bat Team could immediately tell that the wounds were from Azrael's dual swords. The new Batman had crossed the line that Bruce never would have. He murdered Two-Face. The entire Bat Team was both horrified and enraged. Nightwing turned to the others, stating that it was time to get Bruce back. They needed the true Batman. While Bruce had effectively left Gotham to recuperate from his injuries, he had left a lifeline if his allies ever needed his advice or help. Nightwing and the others used this in 1939, 2 years since Bruce had left for Europe. They filled him in on the horrors that Azrael had wrought as the Batman. They informed Bruce of Azrael's vengefulness and increased brutality to the point of breaking Anarky's neck. They told him about their split with the new Batman and how Azrael had beat them to Two-Face and murdered him. Bruce had just read about Dent's death in the news right before receiving this call from his allies. The city had held a small funeral for the former public figure. They had given him a death mask that resembled his face after the accident that had scarred him. Many thought this a controversial decision, but nothing was changed. After telling Bruce about both Anarky and the death of Harvey Dent, he decided that he had spent enough time healing. His injuries from the Shadow War would never fully heal, and his back had recovered enough that he was able to train and move again. It would never be the same as it once was, but Bruce had a rage burning inside of him, a feeling he had not felt in a long time. He had spent so many of the previous years being exhausted and burnt out. This fire within him reminded him why he had started on his crusade in the first place, to keep what happened to him as a child from happening to anyone in Gotham ever again. He got on the first plane back to Gotham that he could. Since leaving Gotham in 1937, Bruce had visited numerous places in Europe to recover. Not much is known about this time, merely rumors. Some of his allies speculated that he had visited his former mentor, Giovanni Zatara, for some kind of rehabilitation. Others speculated that he had received experimental surgeries from a number of sources, one being Dr. Fritz Lang in Germany. These are merely rumors, as Bruce never disclosed to his allies or in his journals what he had experienced in those 2 years. Regardless of the ambiguity of this time that Bruce took, his recovery was nothing short of miraculous for the time. Bruce had set out to mend his body as well as his spirit,
and had been reminded of the foundation of his training. He had indeed healed physically, but also saw the toll that being the Batman had taken mentally. Bruce had found hope in his time away, and had been at peace with how far he had come over the years. When he received word from Nightwing, Oracle, and the Bat Team, he felt that peace dissipate. He had left unfinished business in Gotham. He had chosen Azrael as his successor, and now felt a responsibility. Azrael had dragged the title of Batman through the mud with his actions, and destroyed any semblance of trust that still existed between Gotham and its so-called protector. Bruce felt rage because Harvey had been killed, yes, but he also felt rage for other reasons. A betrayal of trust, a lack of understanding about Bruce's intentions, and the danger that Azrael had put the city in. Bruce looked to his roots as he flew back to Gotham. Bruce looked to a time before the Batman. The Bat Team met Bruce after he landed almost immediately. They all left together in plain clothes and went to the Bat Team's main base of operations, a hideaway within the city. There they began to enact a plan. Azrael had been relying heavily upon the Sacred Order of St. Dumas for resources. The secret organization had centuries of funding and a network of spies feeding Azrael information. Nightwing informed Bruce that they had discovered the Order's existence not long after Bruce had left for Europe. He told Bruce that they had identified the leader of the Order as Nomaz, a warrior and monk. Bruce pondered this, thinking back to Andrea Beaumont's last words to him. "The Order did this to me. They killed who I was. They made me the Phantasm." Bruce informed them of this, and by connecting the dots, surmised that the Phantasm had quite possibly been another adherent to the Order's so-called system. Bruce assumed that Andrea had used that training to become a deadly assassin, and then left when the Order chose John Paul Valley as their avenging angel. Informing everyone of this, Bruce instructed them to track down and apprehend Nomaz and any members of the Order that tried to stop them. Bruce told them that he would handle Azrael. Damian, interjecting into this conversation, asked if his father wanted his bat suit. Bruce shook his head. He stated that in order to defeat this new Batman, he would need to be something different, something primal. Bruce had received a gift from one of his mentors decades ago, before he had chosen to become the Bat. It was a mask he had received while training with the League of Assassins. It was called the Mask of Tengu. This mask represented a bat spirit and was the inspiration for what would eventually become the cowl of the Batman. Bruce hoped that a return to his roots would give him the strength he needed and allow him to defeat this adversary. The Bat Team set out and used their intel to track down and apprehend Nomaz, as well as some members of the Order of St. Dumas present in Gotham. Bruce set fire to the street outside of Gotham's courthouse with burning letters stating, "This ends now, imposter." Bruce lay in wait for Azrael to see it and show himself. The grandstanding Azrael did see the message and stood outside the courthouse shouting for the Bat to come and face him. Bruce approached him, the both of them standing in the street outside. Outside the very place where justice was decided on daily, the fate of Gotham would be decided by the two Batmen. Azrael attacked Bruce with a ferocity that years of training and conditioning had lent him. Azrael knew how the Batman fought and tried to use that to his advantage. Bruce, on the other hand, was not the same man he had been 2 years prior. Bruce had taken time to heal, mentally and physically, and had adopted a fighting style to suit that growth. Bruce met Azrael's ferocity and training with cold, calculated rage and focus. Azrael grew more and more angry and frustrated that his opponent was repelling his onslaught with relative ease. Eventually, Azrael made a mistake, and Bruce took advantage of that. With a sudden burst of blows and precise strikes, Bruce took Azrael down to the ground. Bruce stood over his fallen foe. The mantle of the Batman had been reclaimed from the imposter. Azrael was taken into police custody, as well as Nomaz and the members of the Order that had been apprehended. The records and journals of the Bat Team refer to this period in Gotham's history as Knightfall. It was the final chapter of the 20-year period where the Batman was most active. Gotham and its citizens had been through hell and back. The rise of organized crime had filled it with evil and corruption. With the rise of the Batman, it had been all but eliminated. In spite of this, the threat of the Court of Owls had made itself known. The Batman had nearly lost his sanity to that enemy, but he prevailed. Those under the court's control were freed, though not without scars, physical and mental. The Bat had made an impact on society, forming alliances with the police and other authorities. The press had turned him into a sensation. Gotham had survived costumed supercriminals, economic disasters, and threats of all kinds. The Shadow War had destroyed many lives, even if the costume vigilantes had prevailed over Ra's al Ghul and his assassins. It was enough to sour the city against the Batman and his allies. And now, with the rise and fall of Azrael as the villainous new Batman, it had seen a definitive chapter come to an end. Many sought to collate the records and reports of the 20 years between 1919 and 1939. Renee Montoya stepped forward to take this on. Years later in the present day, this record would be found in a trunk and brought to the light of history. It revealed much chaos, turmoil, and insight into Gotham during that time period. It also revealed bravery, heroism, and perseverance. It showed a group of individuals willing to fight in the face of great adversity. Though it is still debated whether or not their impact was good or bad on Gotham, it shaped the history of the city nonetheless. The Batman would forever symbolize hope for some people, the hope that one could obtain truth and justice. It still stands today as a testament to the ability of humanity to fight and persevere. Many others would be inspired by those 2 decades. Even with the threat of World War II looming, the example set in Gotham would be a staple for some fighting against the horrors and atrocities that it would bring. The Batman's career may have ended, but the hope he inspired will never be forgotten. Like all things, the era of the Batman and other costume vigilantes and criminals came to an end. Some debate still whether or not he was a force for good or ill in Gotham. He had inspired heroism and hope within many, but also anger and resentment in others. As the threat of World War II loomed, the idea of grown men and women in costumes vying for the fate of Gotham seemed trivial in comparison. Bruce in particular would put aside the thought of returning as Batman for decades, instead vying to use his wealth and resources to aid the Allies in the war. They would need it against the horrors that World War II would bring. This conflict would hasten the arrival of oncoming change and a horrific global awakening. Gotham would not be exempt from its influence, nor would most of the world. Although the career of the Batman had only lasted for 20 years, the impact it had was phenomenal. His Crusade's legacy would shape certain aspects of society for years to come. Many films, books, and even Broadway shows would all take inspiration from the Batman's battle for justice. One such production was Batman Beyond, directed by John Carlinger. This thrilling serial of 12 chapters captivated audiences when it was released in theaters. Another production was The Badette Follies of 1939, a burlesque-style stage show that celebrated the more colorful aspects of Gotham's costumed and caped vigilantes and villains. The Batman would have a veritable ripple effect on popular culture and would be idolized by some, criticized by others. Even his harshest critics couldn't deny one fact, though. The Batman had a larger-than-life cultural impact. While Bruce Wayne retired the cape and cowl, many of his allies and enemies took on roles in their own way over the following years. Alfred, near the end of the final Knightfall conflict, would be hospitalized. This was due to the injuries he had sustained in the Shadow War worsening. Alfred would eventually die in 1939, with some speculating this as the final straw driving Bruce to retire. Tim Drake would eventually enter law enforcement. He would join the recently rebranded Bureau of Investigation, now known as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI. As an agent, he helped pioneer new profiling strategies and forensic investigation techniques. This would revolutionize law enforcement for the modern era. Before Knightfall, Luke Fox returned to Europe on special assignment. Bruce had asked him to go there after reading the signs of a rising evil there. Luke was tasked with raising a fighting force for the coming conflict. He rallied a squadron of rogue pilots into a group known throughout World War II as the Black Hawks. After the events of the Bamber Bridge incident, he would become disillusioned with fighting and retire in the south of France. The remainder of his life would be peaceful. Another event that occurred during World War II was an incursion into France by Task Force X. This covert ops team operated under direct orders from Harry S. Truman. It was commanded by the war hero Rick Flag. Also in command under Flag was Dick Grayson, alias Nightwing. The team was composed of costumed criminals that had been apprehended throughout the years. Among them was Atom Smasher, Deathstroke, Captain Boomerang, Deadshot, Slipknot, and Harley Quinn. Harley in particular, being of Jewish descent, hated the Nazi forces with a passion. Not much is known about the specifics of the mission, but what is known is that Nightwing and many others on this covert ops team died in the line of duty in France. Nightwing was honored as an American hero by Harry S. Truman posthumously. In the meantime, Oracle would use her skills in World War II as a codebreaker. Upon hearing of Nightwing's death in 1943, she would be heartbroken, but it would give her a renewed vigor in the war effort. She would go on to attend law school and would become Gotham's first female district attorney in 1948. After the Shadow War, the League of Assassins were leaderless and without purpose. Their attention eventually shifted to the rise of fascism in Europe. Upon reaching young adulthood, Damian Wayne would eventually leave Gotham and take on the role his grandfather Ra's had wanted for him, to assume leadership of the League. In the wake of World War II, he changed the group's name to the League of Shadows and took on a new name of his own. He combined his father and mother's different teachings into this persona. Word began to rise of this new group and their leader, the Heretic. Bearing an uncanny resemblance to the Batman of Gotham City, he did not just protect one city or country, he aimed to protect the world. The Heretic vowed to never let another war to end all wars happen again. In the mid-1940s, Gotham faced another crisis. After Knightfall, the city saw relative peace until a fire broke out at Arkham Asylum. With the Batman retired, the city panicked when Arkham's most dangerous inmates ran loose on the streets. For months, people lived in fear. Many other places in the U.S. would nickname Gotham Arkham City during this tumultuous event. In the midst of the terror, a mysterious new figure rose. They wore body armor inspired by the Batman and would quickly quell the chaos. As suddenly as this figure appeared, they disappeared once the threat abated. The media dubbed this figure as the Arkham Knight. To this day, no one knows the true identity of the vigilante. Some speculate that it was Bruce Wayne temporarily returning to the role of the Batman. Others speculate that it was Red Hood under a new persona. Still more think it was neither. The Joker was one of the escapees of Arkham Asylum. He was never recaptured, and there are no known sightings following his final disappearance. Many speculate that this is because of the Batman's retirement. Without someone to counteract his chaos with order, the Joker simply may not have seen the point. All that remained were his final words, scrawled in blood on his cell wall. All the world's a stage, all men and women merely players. Other costumed criminals in Gotham managed to turn their lives around. Selina Kyle, alias the Catwoman, would be one of these mostly unscathed individuals. She would go on to create and run a much-needed women's shelter in Gotham City. It received plenty of funding from the Wayne Foundation, but stood on its own legs, too. In the end, Bruce Wayne had sacrificed a great deal for Gotham and the Batman. His body had been broken countless times, his mind had endured much strain, and his drive had refocused. All of these factors forced him to give up his original crusade. During World War II, Bruce started numerous initiatives to help fund the Allies. His body may not have been up to the fight, but his mind and resources were. He is credited with using his influence and status in aiding the OSS with their intelligence effort. He is also credited, alongside Alan Dulles, with the recruitment of Fritz Kolbe and becoming a spy for the Allies. After the end of the Second World War, he would start numerous charities and organizations under the Wayne name, continuing to be a hero in any way he could. With the rise of a new, vicious gang in 1955, Gotham saw even more terror. Bruce, now much older, saw another threat that no one was standing up to. Preparing himself, he donned the cowl of the Batman one last time. He was aided by a new Robin whose identity was one Carrie Kelly. Together they worked to dismantle this gang known as the Mutants. Eventually, Bruce became a victim of the same thing everyone does: time. As his mind began to go, he lost himself. He spent his last days tormented by demons and monsters from his past. Years later, after his death, the secret of his identity and exploits would be revealed to the world. The legacy of the Batman would continue to inspire many generations. Whether the Batman really helped fight crime or was the reason it escalated to absurd levels will be forever a subject of debate. Medical and law enforcement fields are still not at a general consensus. The evidence presented in this series is not intended to pass judgment, but to represent the truth about what transpired. This has been an account of Gotham, 1919 to 1939.
All you want is my hunger. All you need is my pain. Nothing in between ever meant you lost. When you were born there was thunder, fire lit in the sky as to lead astray. Now heavy rain pours out of you.